Well, we are starting a brand new sermon series called Remember His Faithfulness. If you would, grab your handout this morning, and if you would, turn to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. This morning, we're talking about the idea of God comforting you in your current trials by remembering how He handled yesterday's trials. Really, in a lot of ways this morning, we're talking about your memory. You realize your entire life is in existence in your memory. All the things that you've ever lived, all the conversations you've had are inside of your mind. And really, if you forget what is in your mind, then you're beginning to forget the things that's happened in your life. I want you to think of it this way. One of the ways that we remember great things that have happened to us is we keep around pictures, right? You see a picture hanging on your wall and go, oh, that's right. I remember that day I did that specific thing with this person. I had the pleasure of going over to the Johnson's home, and you could be in there a while talking about some great memories because they've got a lot on their walls. And I felt really foolish because all throughout the whole day, Brother Norm would say, do you know what that is? I'd have to say, no, sir, I don't know. That's a peanut something or something. He'd tell me a story, and I go, wow. I felt like a city folk a lot when I was at their house, you know. I'm like, I know concrete and power poles. That's how I grew up. Okay, so. But, you know, when you have these things on your walls, you can remember what the Lord's done. You can remember stories. And not only that, but isn't it great to be around people who you shared your formative years with? And as we get older, there's fewer and fewer of them. I really cherish the people that I grew up with, that I can say a memory from when I was a little boy, and somebody can say, I remember that. And as you get older, those relationships become fewer and fewer. But isn't it a wonderful thing to know that you can go and remember parts of your life by whether it's a scrapbook or a piece of paper or an item that you have or a person you're talking to? But I wonder if we didn't have any of those things, how many memories we would actually forget. So it brings me to my next startling thought, which is this. If you act the same way in your spiritual life, and you don't make a memorial for something God's done for you spiritually, we will forget. Abraham Lincoln has a good quote on memory. He says, no man has a good enough memory to be a successful liar. Boy, that's kind of missing from Washington, D.C. these days, isn't it? I think we can all say amen to that. I remember my dad teaching me as I was growing up. He said, listen, Ken, if you always tell the truth, you have nothing to worry about. You know what I found out as I got older? There's a lot of truth to that. I found out that's a much easier way to live, and I don't have anything to worry about. If I'm always honest and tell the truth, hey, listen, you might have to tell on yourself sometimes. You might have to say that was my fault sometimes, but you don't have to remember anything. So I like this quote from Abraham Lincoln. Our big idea this morning, we are in Psalm 78, the first 11 verses. And our big idea this morning, in other words, if we were to condense down all of what we're trying to talk about in just a simple sentence, it would be this. God's plan for comforting me during my current trial is by reminding me of His past actions in times of uncertainty. Let's break that down. God does have a plan for comforting you right now in your trials today. Sometimes we say, Lord, where are you? Hey, it doesn't mean that your trial will go away. It doesn't mean that your trial will disappear. He just has a mechanism to get you through it. Remember what Jesus said when He was praying. He said, I could have prayed that my followers were taken out of the world. But He said, I don't want to do that. I just want to comfort you as you go through. So God's plan for comforting you during your current trial. Maybe you're here this morning. Maybe you're at the place where you just need to hear me say that God does have a plan in your current trial. But let me get a little bit more specific. His plan in your current trial is to remind you of His past actions in the other times in your life where you're uncertain. The setting for this psalm is very simple. It's a historic psalm. It's recanting a story, and it's retracing the failures of Ephraim during wartime. So let's join together in a very exciting passage in Psalm 78, and let's just look at verse 1 to begin. Psalm 78 and verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. as we get into this very first psalm, this is a psalm or a saying of Asaph. The very first thing he's saying is, listen, for us to accomplish this morning, we're endeavoring, you realize this morning, we are endeavoring to complete a very difficult task this morning. We're endeavoring to take a very hurtful situation and not really totally make sense of it, but at least get through it. And this is one thing I love about God's Word. God's Word does not try and stray away from the hard topics. Listen, if this was a book written by man, you wouldn't see any of the failures of the heroes of the stories, and you'd probably try and just go over the hard topics. The Bible takes the hardest thing in your life and hits it dead on and doesn't try to beat around the bush. And the first thing that we see in verse 1, the psalmist says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." Here's an application from verse 1. Here's something you can take home just from verse 1. It is much easier to recall the great actions of God when you have a constant flow of godly information coming into your mind. You can't cut off the flow of information coming into your mind. You can't say, well, I love listening to political radio. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But if you replace getting fed spiritually by listening to politics 10 hours a day, you're going to be a miserable person. I'm not saying don't be informed. That's not what I said. I'm saying if you have a constant stream of something, that will be your fuel to get through the day. You say, I just love listening to old-timey music. Hey, I'm not preaching against old-timey music, but what I'm saying is this. If you have a constant flow of something other than the gospel of Jesus and the goodness of God, that will be your fuel to get through the day. Look at what it says in verse 1. Asaph says, "Give ear, O my people." It says, listen to me, listen to my law. Incline your ears. You know what that means? You know what an incline is. It's a hill. I can remember back when I was a boy, some of the most terrifying moments of my life. I grew up in Seattle. And I can remember, I don't know what it was, my dad, he had an Infiniti for a car with, what am I trying to say, car guys? Yeah, thank you. Cylinder, that's the word I was looking for. 4-cylinder and standard, both of them. So we had the mighty Yugo, was one of our cars. Have you ever seen a Yugo? And I mean, we're not small people. We'll leave it at that. There was 4 kids. I was the youngest. Yugo. You want to know what our other behemoth of a car was? Ford Fiesta. The sister of the Yugo, right? And so these were our 2 cars. And so I can remember, if I can paint this picture for you, with 4 kids in the back seat, back in those days, I can remember, I mean, I didn't grow up that long ago, but I can remember when it was totally acceptable, when I used to spend trips and road trips. You know the area, as the back window came down, there's that little area you put like your hat or something? I remember laying there on long trips. Anybody else remember that? I would lay there because I could feel the warmth of the sun, you could watch everything, and life was great. I can remember sitting on my mom's lap in the front seat. I mean, we made it. We're survivors. If you lived today, you'd be, somebody call the police on you or something. We had rode our bikes without helmets and made ramps that weren't nailed together, and it was great. It was fantastic. And without health insurance. I mean, I don't know how we did it. It's just miracles of God. But I can remember being in these small cars, and I can remember going, if you've ever been in Seattle, it's basically a city that's built on the bay that had a great fire in the 1800s, and they built another city. Rather than cleaning it up, they did like a Disney thing. They're like, well, this is a lot of mess, so let's just build a city above it. That's how Seattle was built. And that's perfect, right, for a place that's, might have an earthquake at any second. Good idea. Let's put it all on stilts, yes. So that was the place I grew up. So as a result of that, right from the water, I remember being down by the piers as a little kid and being in our Yugo, and I can remember, 4-cylinder. I remember Dad, and it was a manual, so I can remember him putting the clutch in and putting it down, and Dad, you could hear the RPMs. We'd go. But here's the thing. There were so many hills there, but there's one more part to this thing. You know about Seattle raining a lot. You've heard this before. This is not myth. This is fact, right? It has a long rainy season there. And I can remember one more part to this story. Us being on a hill, right? I mean, it was the kind of hill that Goliath would look at and go, that's a hill, right? This is not a slope. And I can remember being in this thing, and I can remember looking behind us at the other car, and my dad would get so mad at tailgaters. And these people would be right next to our bumper because, they had a more powerful car and an automatic. So they let off of their brake and they're just ready to roll. Where we had to go, first gear, clutch, let off the brake, roll back, and it catches. I remember I'd look behind me as a little boy and I'd see our car starting to roll back and I'd think, oh my goodness gracious, we're going to hit this person. And sometimes we did. We did, honest to goodness, we'd hit them. And my dad would go, their fault for being so close, you know. And you're on a hill like this, no one's going to get out of their car. You'd roll all the way down the hill. We can't do that. But I got to throw one more thing out there to take this story to the next level. You know, in Seattle, we'd always have these grates. You remember these long steel grates that big cities would put over areas that they're working on because that was their access to underneath the ground? So rather than just having a manhole cover or something, they'd put these huge, massive 20-foot, 30-foot slabs of steel down, and you're literally on a plate of steel. You don't even have the grip of concrete. You're on a slip and slide at this angle in a 4-cylinder Yugo with 6 people in the car and a guy behind you is this far away. And I'm going, I just hate this. As a kid, I hated it so much. I hated it so much. You know what we were on? Listen to this. We were on an incline, a steep incline. And all of our momentum shifted down. Now let's read verse 1 again. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline, incline, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. You know, here's the thing. It is much easier to recall the great actions of God when you have a constant flow of godly information coming into your mind. You know how to do that? Just start inclining everything in your life to hear what God has to say. Let's look at verse 2. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old. Verse 3. Which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. I want you to notice that this is not new information that Asaph is going to say in verses 2 and 3. And I want you to notice that by and large, the information that you hear me say today will not be new information. In fact, Asaph says clearly in verse number 3, you've heard these and you've known these. And you've heard your fathers tell you before. But I want you to notice in verse number 2 a couple of interesting words. Remember the word parable? We talked about that in the New Testament when Jesus was teaching a parable. If you break down this word in 2 different ways, you have para and you have the word bol. Para means alongside of, like you remember paramilitary, parasite, something like this. The word para means alongside of. The word bol means literally to throw. You know this from bowling. That's where the word comes from. Hyperbolic. That means something that's being in movement. So a parable is literally to throw something alongside of something. And so he's throwing a truth down alongside of another truth in verse number 2. And he says, I'm going to open my mouth now. And I'm going to do it in a parable. I'm going to throw something down of equal truth next to something that you know. And I'm going to utter dark sayings. And these dark sayings don't mean evil. They mean things that you haven't dusted off for a while. So maybe this morning, that's what we need to go over. The goodness of God that maybe we haven't dusted off for a while. Maybe these sayings aren't hard to understand, but they're dark because they haven't been dusted off for a while. So in verse 3, he says, you know these things, our fathers have told us. Here's an application you can take away home with you from verses 2 and 3. To recall the greatness of God in the past, I must be willing to open up about past hurts. Did you know that this morning? If you're going to be real about this situation, if you're going to get victory in this area, what he's saying in verses 2 and 3 is, these are things that you know, these are things you haven't heard for a while, and we must be willing to talk about the past. Because you see the connection this morning? If I'm going to talk about the past victories of God getting me through trials, then I also have to be willing to talk about the trials. But since we like to close things off that hurt us, we always forget also the solution to the trial. If you're going to close off the trial, you're going to also forget the solution to the trial. So he says, listen, we're going to talk about these things, but I want you to know that to recall the greatness of God in the past, I must be willing to open up about past hurts. That's not always fun, is it? But if you're not willing to talk about what God's done, hey, if the children of Israel forgot that he brought them out of bondage in Egypt, you know why? They forgot all the hurts of it. In fact, they said things like, I miss the garlic and the leeks and the good things. They're remembering all the good things. It's like their mind, that us humans have this ability to block out hurtful things. And since they blocked out the hurtful things, they forgot about the Lord delivering them out of those hurtful things. They only remembered good. And you know what that makes us do? That makes us despise the deliverance of God. It doesn't make any sense for him to deliver us. If I forget my trial, then Lord, why did you even deliver me? I had it better back there. Because we as humans have the ability to completely block off hurt. And solutions don't make sense if you don't have hurt in your mind. Let's look at verse 4 together. We will not hide them from their children. What's he talking about before we go further? Hide them. He's talking about the dark sayings of verse 2. Hey, listen, if you have some difficulty you went through in the past, it's really good to tell the kids about it. Because then they're going to go through difficulty and they're going to say, well, Mom and Dad never went through anything like this. They just always prayed for our food before we ate, and they just always smiled and loved on each other. They would never went through anything. So God must not be real for me because I'm going through it. Listen, you know what's really good? Let your kids see you cry once in a while. Let them see you go before the Lord and kneel before your bed and say, Lord, I'm confused. Lord, help me get through this trial. I need you to come through in this area. And let them know there's a reality in the world of hardships and a very real God who can get us through. So in verse 4 he says, we will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. Isn't that a marvelous verse? This is a marvelous verse. Listen, we're going to talk about the past actions. At True Grace Church, we want you to be able to come in here, and maybe it might be a good thing to say, it's not healthy to forget about past hurts. You sweep that stuff under the rug, and there's going to be a whole host of emotional problems. We want to bring those things front and center and deal with them in a godly and biblical way, in a very real way. And when you get victory over that thing, when you learn what God wants you to learn from it, then we're going to tell our kids about exactly what God has done, that he will bring them through their hurts as well. Here's an application you can take from verse 4. We do a huge disservice to our children when we hide from them the principles of how we work through trials. Huge disservice. I'm not suggesting that you don't use wisdom. Obviously, there are things that you might word differently. You don't go to them and say, hey, we're stressed out. We might not have the money for rent. Don't do that. You don't have to make them scared about everything. But use wisdom, and the Lord will show you there's times to pull your children into, especially in the case of Psalm 78, the victory had already been won. You don't need to go to them and cry and say, I'm nervous right now. But you certainly could go to them and say, listen, we went through this last month and God delivered us, and here's how we handled it. Let's look at verses 5 through 8. Speaking of the Lord, for he established a testimony in Jacob. So we're starting to go through the history, and maybe we need to do that for you as well this morning. Maybe I need to remind you, some of you this morning, and say, remember when you graduated college? Remember some of the stories when you first started out and you didn't know what to do? That's kind of what Asaph is doing. He's saying in verse 5, let's start at Jacob. So let's just pick a starting point for your life. Maybe it's when you went to the military. Maybe it's when you were in high school. You got to pick a point in your mind where you can go back to and specifically say, right here was this starting point for me. He picks Jacob for the history of Israel. I don't know what it is for you this morning, but pick a place this morning. Verse number 5. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children. Part of what the children of Ephraim were struggling with is that in verse 5 it says specifically that they were to make a commitment to share with their children something. So worry in a lot of ways can be hereditary. Verse 6. That the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. Verse 7. That they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. Do you see the logic of this? You might be here this morning and say, Pastor, I'm almost 90 years old. What could I possibly do? You could spend the rest of your life applying this morning's message, and your life will be a grand success. You could get creative ways to tell your story, to kids all around you. You have no idea the impact that you could make on future generations by just simply telling your story of God's faithfulness. Hey, listen, if God's victory of your life dies with you, then there's no impact to another generation. You'll only be giving them an inheritance of worry and an uncertainty of knowing how to deal with today's trials. So he says here, let's talk about Jacob. God made a law with Jacob that he would tell the children what he's done. Verse 7, why? 7 answers the why. Why are we doing this, Pastor Ken? Why are we in Remember His Faithfulness this month? Here's why. That they might set their hope in God. That's why. That you'll give hope to people. You could this morning, if I could say it this way, you could be a hope dealer, okay? Deal some hope to people. That would combat current crisis today. Verse 8 says this, it might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that was set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. Do you know what verse 8 is saying? If you can get the power of verse 8, then you'll understand my story better too. And I don't know if this is your story or not, but this is my story. Verse 8 is talking about breaking the chains of a family heritage. You see, my mom and my dad both came from very broken homes. Both of my parents had a story of trying to get out of their homes as fast as they could. My mom was greatly abused growing up. Greatly abused by family members and close friends of the family. I put friends in quotation marks. They certainly were not friends, and they're very lucky I never had a chance to meet them. I would probably be in jail today if I met anybody that abused my mom the way that she got abused. My mom one afternoon was at home by herself when she was about 15 or 16 years old, and who came on the TV? None other than Billy Graham. And for the first time in my mom's life, she heard the gospel. She learned that there was hope. She learned that there was a God big enough to forgive anything that she had done, and a God that loves her enough to have a relationship with her. And my mom, in her house by herself in the middle of a broken home, accepted Jesus as her Savior, as probably the most infantile and simplistic way a human being could, by just reaching up to the heavens saying, God, I love you. Save me if you will. And my mom got saved that day, and it changed my life forever. My mom and my dad both met in college, both coming from a broken home and having no idea how to raise kids, having no idea how to love the Lord and to serve Him. But they leaned on each other and got married. They just recently celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. All 4 of their kids are saved. God's done a miracle in my life. You know what happened? Verse 8 happened. Because they might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation. I can tell you that I had no relationship at all with either of my grandpas or my grandmas, either one. In fact, the first time I ever met my grandpa on my dad's side, somebody forgot to tell me that he was missing some fingers. That story hadn't crossed paths. Talk about a shock. I've been wanting to have a relationship with my grandpa all these years. I was 13 years old, and he came to my brother John's wedding, the first time I'd met him. And I walked up to him and I said, "Hi, Grandpa." I wanted a grandpa so bad. I wanted to go fishing so bad. I never had anybody that I could hug and have a close uncle or grandma or grandpa. I wanted it so bad. And at 13 years old, I finally met my grandpa for the first time. And I went up, I said, "Hi, Grandpa." And he said, "Oh, please, call me Bob." And I went, "Hi, Bob." And so I thought a hug would be weird at that point, since he corrected the, endearing relationship name. And so I went to shake his hand. This is the point of the story where I shook 2 fingers. I didn't know he had an accident. I had never met him. So I went up to my mom during my brother's wedding and went, "Hi, Mom, can we talk?" And she said, "What is it?" And I said, somebody forgot to tell me that Grandpa, Bob, was missing half a hand." He said, "That would have been helpful before I shook his hand for the first time." I went, "Hey, good to meet you too. Please call me Bob." You know what? My parents both got saved and broke the chain of a godless generation. And this morning, I don't know how many grandkids there are for my parents. I think 16. All the ones that are aware and understand what's going on have been saved. All 3 of my children have. And now they're going to marry people that are saved. If they don't, I'll kill them. So that's just how that works. So you say, "How do you know that, Pastor?" Because I'll make sure. This isn't being recorded, is it, Chris? Okay. Here's a life application from verses 5 through 8. If I limit my memory to only how I handle, please get, this is really important. If I limit my memory to only how I handle a situation, I will greatly limit my hope in God. See, if I only remember the things I want to remember, and then I only remember my solutions to the things that I want to remember, then I'm going to limit my hope to myself. How great I am, how great I am, right? You say, I would never sing that song. Really? Well, then remember the works of God. Otherwise, you're going to be praising yourself for how you handled situations, and probably badly. And your hope will be very small, and your worry will be very big. Verses 9 through 11, let's read together, we'll be done. And this is the part of the story where you can say, well, what happens if I don't do this? This is the part of the story that I hope, as you read this passage, will grip your heart and convict you of this, because here's wisdom from God's word. Verse 9, the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. My friends, this morning, don't let that be your story. Don't let it be your story. They came, they got armed, they prepared. They had a burden on their back from carrying things, and then the battle came and they ran away. Why? Why? Verse number 10 says, they kept not the covenant of God, and they refused to walk in His law. You see what happens when I reject what the Lord has for me? Hey, listen, when my house is starting to get, when my mortgage is late and I don't know what's going to happen to my car, and I don't know, Pastor, you don't even understand. At work, they're talking about this thing, or Pastor, you don't understand. My grandson is doing this thing. Hey, listen to me. If you're only looking at your current situation, you'll lose hope for sure. I am not disputing that. If there's no other reservoir to choose from, you'll lose hope. But verse number 10 says that the children of Ephraim, they turned back in the day of battle because they kept not the covenant of God, and they refused to walk in His law. Verse number 11, some of the saddest words in the Bible, they forgot His works and His wonders that He had showed them. They didn't fail because God never revealed it to them. Do you see that? It wasn't that they failed because no one ever told them. Verse 11 is so sad to me because the children of Ephraim had clearly heard the faithfulness of God presented to them. But verse 11 says this, they forgot His works and His wonders. What happened to them? They had been shown these things by God, it says in verse 11. Here's an application I could take home with me this morning from verses 9 through 11. Listen to this, please, if you get nothing else. The high price of forgetting the works of God is turning back in the war of life when I am meant to fight on for His cause. I'm going to read that again. The high price of forgetting the works of God is turning back in the war of life when I am meant to fight on for His cause. I wonder how many great things we'd accomplish for the Lord if we'd get this very simple message this morning down. Now, if you're here this morning and you feel beat up from this because you don't feel you've done a good job, there's hope. Please don't lose hope. I hope you feel somewhat convicted this morning, but I promise you, the next part, next week, will give you tremendous insight into how to do this. In fact, we're going to have a lot of fun with it. It might even involve a fun craft. You say, I've got wedding pictures up. Okay, do you have memorials up for the things God's done for you? Hey, we're going to have a lot of fun with this, okay? And we're going to have things in our life that will remind us of all that God's done. And my prayer for this is that if you're here this morning and that you're completely burdened by things you're going through, I'm praying that through this we'll conjure up memories. And I wonder if we were to ask this morning how many memories God has brought to mind of things He's done for you, even while we're talking about it this morning. I bet you we'd have hands up all over the place saying, you know what, since we've been talking about it the last half hour, I've been reminded of things God's done for me. Hey, listen, we need to get much more proficient at that. And we're going to have a great time over the course of the month of July talking about how to get better at this. So if this one was a more of a convicting one, then that's good. But the rest of them will be much more informational on how to accomplish this in your life. I hope this was a blessing to you today, and I hope that this is something you can take home with you. This is circling back all the way around. Our big idea this morning was very simple. God's plan for comforting me during my current trial is by reminding me of his past actions in times of uncertainty.
You promised